was telling Ryan I like today's topic because it's coming off of the building muscle over 40. Then there was one there about looking out for who you're getting your information from a fitness influencer perspective, and the confusion that exists out there. When Ryan brought this topic up for me, I was like, okay, but where is this coming from?
Yeah.
And it basically leads down who these people, who the audience is, but then also the information they're given and the frustration that they're kind of showing. And then this kind of infighting between professionals, if you will, about who's right, who's wrong, whatever else. And so I got to be honest. So I'm just going to be honest and putting this out there with this topic. And that is, when Ryan brought it up, I'm like, why are we talking about this? Is such a fucking boring conversation for me, because I've been hearing this back and forth forever. It was kind of like, so I just backed out of it. I'm like, I'm not even going to have this conversation, because unless somebody's really committed to the conversation and actually having a conversation about it and listening, rather than I've already made up my mind and you are wrong, then this just ends up going nowhere. And I think there's a lot of room for being right, and there's a lot of room for being quote unquote wrong. And it's such a broad spectrum of things that we're talking about here. I think that's where things get lost. And it's interesting, like, because it creates drama.
Yes.
And I don't mean that like in a negative sense, just the back and forth conversation. It's a popular topic to bring up in social media, which is what's fucking driving this. So let's get to it. What are we talking about today, Ryan?
Talking about all things abs. Just abs. Hot topic, right? So this gets talked about so much, and I think gets butchered a lot. It's weird. I feel like we live in a society where people get pretty dogmatic about their beliefs in all spectrum. Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, yeah.
That's weird.
So it might be mind-blowing for some people. But man, this is something I see gets hammered a lot on both ends of people, just how you should train your abs, what's core. And I think there's just a lot of confusion and missing out a lot of the nuance, whether it's people trying to just get views, just trying to get recognition for their takes on things, or if these professionals actually like recognize this. I just think there's a lot of these two ends of the spectrum of what is ab training, what is core training. And there's so much confusion based on that, because people don't really, I almost see people getting afraid or getting, again, like dogmatic about you shouldn't be doing this exercise or should be doing this. And I think this is where that conversation of being careful who you're getting your information from and identifying all your training and all your intention with your training with yourself or with your clients through based off one person, what their opinion is, without considering a lot of the larger goals, intentions, all that kind of stuff. So abs.
Yeah. So abs, intention, social media, when somebody's bringing something up. I think the question or the thing that you're saying is like, again, being careful about where you're getting your information from. In order to do that, you have to have a deeper level understanding and awareness of what that thing is in order to be able to vet what you're hearing or who you're hearing it from or whatever else. And I think just in general, like, and I would encourage people to do that with us. Like, if you hear us say something, like, just take it with a grain of salt at face value.
Yes.
And then if you're interested in looking into it, then look into it. Like, we're not saying like you should
look into it or reach out to us and ask us a question.
I think that's another thing, is being available for these kinds of conversations. Yeah. And so I think that's what, again, the podcast is just being available to have these conversations around things in a longer format that don't often get addressed.
Yes.
And sometimes when they do, it's really good. And other times it seems like really off base and agenda based. I don't have an agenda here. I just like, again, you brought this topic up and I was almost like resistant to doing it. I was like, oh man. And then you started to talk to me about it and I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
I see there's and you called me out on something there too. And it was like, you may not be totally aware of these conversations that are happening sort of in general population. And I think it's a fair statement to make, because I don't spend a lot of time with the general population anymore. I spent 20 years doing that. I'm sort of done doing that.
Yes.
I like helping people, but I've gotten to a point where it's interesting, because when I started, I thought it was like, I want to help everybody I can. Now, I'm much more selective about who I'm going to help, because I want to help those that want to help themselves. Yeah, done helping. I'm done. So here's the thing. Like, that's it. Like, I'm done having those fucking conversations where they're circular conversations. You either want to do the work, you're coming to me for answers, and I'm not saying I have them all, but if you're just going to fight me and everything, I'm done.
Yeah.
Like, or if you just want to hop to the next thing, I'm done. Like, we're done. You've shown me your level of commitment. Here's mine. Get the fuck out of here, kind of thing. So with regard to this conversation, that I think that's a good call out. Like, I'll take that respectfully with regard to, okay, so tell me what you're seeing and what you're hearing out there that's created like this urge for you to want to cover this topic because I'm interested. Maybe I am disconnected. I have seen some stuff, but maybe I'm disconnected. Tell me how I'm disconnected.
Was there something you wanted to say real quick, CeCe?
I was just going to say, I was going to jump on the Gen Pop bandwagon because the individuals that are new to us here in the studio, I think they use the term abs and core synonymously.
Oh, yeah,
they don't
definitely.
necessarily know the difference between the two. And so when you start to have that conversation with individuals, they kind of look at you like, what?
Yeah.
Oh, wait, core training's different than abs?
So that's not a new conversation though.
Yes,
Yeah.
but
It's not a new conversation, no, but it's still out there amongst the general population as far as thinking that core training and ab training are synonymous.
Okay, I don't think I'm disconnected from that.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, and so, I mean, there's a social media version of this, and there's the in the trenches with the clients day in and day out.
Okay.
So I think the social media version of this, there's kind of these two dogmatic ends of core training versus ab training and thinking they're synonymous, which a lot of people really do. They don't really understand the nuances or the differences between the two, which again, for us, that's a conversation that's been around since we've been in the industry. It's always been around. But actually people, maybe they didn't grow up in fitness or that's not their interest or whatever. For the general population or I'll even see the general exerciser, even someone who's been exercising for a long time, their understanding of bracing, controlling movement, resisting movement, what is abs, what's your six pack, right? All these different things. They don't know that nuance. They don't. And when we go to social media, which social media, we've talked about a lot, has some benefits of educating people. It is, there is more information out there than there used to be. But what the issue I see a lot, and this is the things coming up on the feed, is people getting very, I hate to say this term again, but dogmatic about the ends of the spectrum of, okay, if my goal is only to have a six pack and I need to be, and I'm wanting to look the best I can, whether I'm a bodybuilder or just trying to be aesthetic, how do I train my abs? But then the people also think that that's the only way to train your abs, where the other end, the people who are athletes or some, let's say definitely like physiotherapists, physical therapists, stuff like that, they preach a very different message of how does an athlete train their abs? And I want to be an athlete and I want to look and train this way specifically. So a lot of people don't understand how both ends can apply to you individually, or one end might apply to you more currently based on what your training goals are, things like that. People don't have that awareness. So I think it's important maybe even we have a little discussion, not getting too into the weeds because this can get kind of boring, of what is abs versus core training? What does that even mean? So a lot of us, when we think abs is our rectus abdominis, our six pack. That's when we think of what looks good in the mirror. That's the kind of common thing. But core training is anything that stabilizes your pelvis, your shoulder girdle, your low back, anything that can have an ability or an attachment, all these different muscles that are even deep to the spine, to the pelvis, all these different things that have some goal in maintaining a solid or stable core in movement.
Okay, so that's a really good explanation without overcomplicating it, without word salading the fuck out of this. And I think that's part of the bigger issue, right? Is how are we defining things?
Yes.
And then how long does it take to actually define it? You just did a really good job there. So it's much larger than I think the majority of people understand with regard to the term, what is core relating to? However, on the other side of the coin, I would say, I'll tell you this, when I started in this industry, the term core wasn't even a term.
Yeah. Yes.
It came up after I got into this industry, and then it got popularized because it meant to people, train your core.
Core is everything.
You'll have abs, you'll have a smaller midsection, waistline, whatever else.
So you should sit on a stability ball while you're at work all day.
Some shit like that, right? So all that kind of stuff. Like this is, as long as you're doing anything that has core training involved in it, or a piece of equipment that says core on it somewhere at the beginning of it or at the end of it, then you are training your core, and you're going to have a smaller midsection, and you're going to be lean and tight and whatever else.
Yes.
So I think there's a large part of the population that also doesn't understand or has used that term inappropriately, maybe for a very long time. So in all kinds of ways. Again, let's step away from that.
Yeah.
So I hear where you're going with that. Is just helping somebody to understand like what we think about, right? As a coach who works with general population and athletes, right? So people in a very large spectrum versus a person you might be hearing talking about it on whatever platform, medium, whatever that you're listening to, when they use the term core or the term abs. So I would agree with you. I think most people, when they think abs, they think rectus abdominis, which is the six pack that you can see when you have, a lean enough body fat, a low enough body fat percentage that it shows, right?
Yes.
I would agree with that. And I think most people, and I don't think this, I know this, most people, confident in saying it, I think in order to do that, you have to do some type of crunching, hip flexion, spinal flexion type of movements. Toes to bar is a popular one or whatever. Why? Because you do a ton of that shit in CrossFit, and those people all have abs. So that's the relation, right? So the quote unquote abs. But in terms of the term, the using the term core, that can get as complex or as complicated as you want to make it.
Yes.
So, but in the end, what are we talking about? And I think that's the distinction of where the thing kind of goes awry. You have to be familiar with who you're listening to saying this and who are they talking about with regard to the population. So I think we're talking about core training or ab training, whatever we're talking about. So we're talking about all things abs here. Talking about that, we have to look at like, what are we actually trying to get accomplished here? Is this a aesthetic goal?
Yes.
Is it a performance goal?
Yes.
Or is this like a longevity goal? And because the way you apply quote unquote exercise or movement, or a lot of the conversation around this topic is very specific to one of those things, which we call the triangle of awareness. What are you trying to get accomplished? And this is where it gets fuzzy.
Well, and this is where it is interesting, because I would have a little pushback on that, because I'd like to think that a lot of people think, oh, I need to be getting some of that. And a lot of people think I need to get some flexion extension. But a lot of people, let's say, do a plank and they feel their rectus abdominis firing. They feel that working. A lot of people are thinking they're going to get a good ab response. They're going to develop their abs, right?
I would agree with that.
So, and again, yes, there's, especially with any exercise we do in isometric, there's going to be some response and there's going to be conditioning and capacity to maintain a movement. But a lot of, there's people who think if I just do a plank, I'm going to get abs, which again, we know, we just talked about that. Anytime we're having an aesthetic goal, the tissue and the joints that that tissue is connected to, there needs to be movement. There needs to be a lengthening, an eccentric lengthening, and a contraction in some sort of load.
Isometrics build muscle for about this long.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Which is a minuscule amount of time before your body's conditioned to, and you won't get any more of a training effect outside of endurance or capacity.
Exactly. So I think that's where the end of this, with people who think only for aesthetics, they're thinking, why would I want to do a plank or a farmer's carry or a dead bug or all these other things?
Yeah, you're talking about like a bodybuilder, somebody who's aesthetic focused.
Exactly. So that's not ab training, right? Ab training is doing these other things that I can progressively overload. I can put through a range of motion. I can have this response where I am building muscle, because yes, your abs are shown through low body fat, but there is still developing the muscle. So I think, so defining your goals, right? Is your goal to be aesthetic, or is your goal to have longevity, or is your goal to have performance, right? Because these are going to be very, very different. And this is where the conversation of abs versus core training is very important, right? So if I think even for like a strength athlete, right? A lot people talk a lot about, of like, let's say in a back squat, like using your lats to stabilize, right? But a lot of people don't really think of that. That's part of your core. That connects to the fascia at the low back. That connects into the hips. That stabilizes, that calms a lot of pressure. That's part of your core, being able to connect with that. That's a performance for the power lifter, right? Or these things that work in slings, these things that work at a crossbody. If you're able to throw, if you're only doing crunches and you're trying to get better at rotating or throwing or different motions, accelerating, decelerating, controlling these forces, and you only do your crunches or toes to bar, you're missing out on a lot of this integration from the lat to the external and internal obliques, across to the even opposite adductor, and all these different nuances of the tissue that goes across that if you're an athlete.
Which is all in the most of it in the abdominal complex.
Exactly, right? So what is the goal? What are you trying to define? And again, we talk about this a lot. Your goals may change throughout the years. So like right now in my training, I just entered a block where I'm trying to work a lot more on aesthetics. So I'm doing a lot of things that are more controllable, going through range of motion. I'm doing leg raises, sit-ups, different things, using machines, even stuff like that. Where in my current block, or my block class before this, I was working more on conditioning and performance, things like that. I was doing a lot of carries. I was doing a lot of rotations.
Nothing isolated.
Right, nothing really isolated. I was working on integration. So that's also probably a good way to think about this too, based on these two goals. A lot of ab training is generally trying to work in something in isolation, so I can get a fatigue or stimulus or mechanical tension on that muscle. Where on the other end, a lot of core training, let's say for the goal of the goal of performance, or even for longevity, is integration. How do I integrate all this tissue together to either have an effect for protecting my spine, protecting my the movement of my back, or for performance and being able to rotate, move quicker, things like that.
Usually can be defined as like
accelerate,
speed and power.
Yes,
we can very easily break that down to like speed and power. Like within the speed and power, the only way to have that is to have control.
Yes.
So we're talking about deceleration, acceleration, things like that. So yeah, I think it's an easy way to kind of break it down for people to not maybe necessarily easy, but a reasonable way to try to breaking it down where people can maybe get that through their head. So I think, again, going back, what is the goal? And then what are, you mentioned some things about like, okay, so if the goal is to have better abs,
yes,
we have to define what does better mean. Like better, what does that mean? You want to see your abs? You want bigger muscles? You want bigger abdominal muscles that you can see?
Yeah.
You want more powerful, strong muscles that you can use.
Yes.
And see.
Yes.
And where is this important for you? Where does it come up for you? Does it come up for you when you're standing on stage in a bathing suit, or does it come up for you when you're on the mat? Does it come up for you when you're on the at the playing baseball, as you use as an example, maybe that you use with like the throwing athlete who's talking about those the oblique slings and such. So yeah, I think that's the other thing you have to kind of break down to understand, like, what is core training for me, and specifically what I'm looking for when we're talking about all things abs, because none of that inherently is going to get you to have an aesthetic look, right? Until you can actually see those things underneath the body fat or whatever else. So. Because we always hear like abs are made in the kitchen. You can
yes and no.
Yes, they're revealed in the kitchen.
That's probably the better way of looking at it.
They're revealed in the kitchen, but they're still made in the gym to an extent. Yeah.
All right. So what do you want people to know about like ab training then? And so, I mean, we've kind of broken it down, like all these different approaches you might take based on the goal dependent outcomes that you're looking for. But what suggestions would you make for people on how to maybe take a different approach to this? And let me just preface this with, I really like what you said there about the plank. Like the plank to me is a very elementary movement.
Yes.
Can you get some value out of it as an advanced athlete? For sure.
Yeah.
But you're going to really have to put some work into that to make that worth your while. And it's what I mean by that is thought, not necessarily like effort.
Yes.
Thought and where I would put this, like where does it show up for me in this thing? Because you're not likely, if you are a highly trained athlete, the plank, unless you're doing some really funky stuff.
Yeah. Not traditional.
Yeah, is not likely going to produce like an overload effect to where you're going to get some type of a training effect outside of the overload effect being in the capacity realm. That is doing work, right?
Yes,
and
the ability to continue to do work or do work.
And all the different things that you might need to do. And so maybe a plank fits in there somewhere. But I would argue, like, I think you could probably pick a lot of other things that would give you a much better training effect. So where does a plank fit in? So I have my own thoughts on that, but my point of that is like, where do these different things fit in for the different people that are training them? And we started this very upfront with like, again, these camps are divided.
Yes.
A lot of it is like on purpose, right? So they can create this conversation and keep it going back and forth. And I don't want this conversation to be gratuitous in that sense. Like like I said, I really rather not be involved in that conversation at all because it's boring to me.
Yeah.
But in the sense of helping people understand how to approach their core/ab training and maybe define what that actually is for them so that they can be more efficient with it and more effective with it, I'm all about it. So let's talk about that.
Well, really quick, it's funny. I just thought about, we had an experience with someone that we know who was doing their workout, who in this workout, they didn't really think about when training their abs. They did.
Oh, that's right.
They did sit-ups in their sequence 1 to failure, loaded sit-ups, very, very challenging sit-ups prior to doing their deadlifts. And then they hurt their back after that, right? So that was just
causation, correlation.
There's a lot of nuance there. There's
whatever
other things.
About the question is, why the fuck would you do that?
Yes, exactly. So again, let's talk about this. So the goal mainly of a sit-up for the most part is to train the abs, right? To train movement at the spine. Ideally, there's movement at the spine. Some people are not very good at controlling that to spine, right? A lot of hip flexion, a lot of flexion extension at the spine, and be able to get into a deep flexion to work the abs. But regardless, the goal is training the abs. So when we're doing that, that's something that is needed to have a good stimulus to build muscle. Those things probably should be done later in your workout when the goal is to build muscle, to fatigue a system that is probably important to work another movement or in another day, things like that. So if we're thinking, I want to train my abs for aesthetics for goals, some tips to think about that is on these movements that one, they're not competing, that they're going to take away from another movement. So again, this kind of example, maybe don't train spinal movement to fatigue, flexion extension with a sit-up
in isolation.
In isolation before you do something like a heavy deadlift, where your goal is to resist movement. Your goal in a deadlift is to maintain as rigid of a trunk as you can, so that your hips and knees can go through flexion extension.
Right. People might argue that, but that is generally speaking, in terms of producing power and force, that is probably the most efficient way to do it.
Yes, exactly.
It's not that there won't ever be any movement involved there.
Yes.
But when we're training in it, right, and we're overloading it through these different movement patterns, that is a smart way to approach it, knowing that when we're on the mat, on the field, and whatever else, there's going to be movement, and hopefully that training and the additional training we'll do, which I'm sure we're going to talk about here, puts us in a position to stay as efficient and as powerful and strong as we possibly can when movement is applied.
Yes, exactly. Okay. So this kind of applies to where I mentioned this on another podcast. I can't remember which one it was, but I talked about when, like, let's say warming up there's this return effect of engaging a system so you have connection to it, but not overly fatiguing that it takes it away from the following movement. Mm-hmm. So that's a good example there of, even if your goal is training your abs, if it's going to take away from the next movement that you're doing, maybe that should be saved either for later in the workout for another day. But for developing abs, just like any other movement, it's well known now, it needs to be progressively overloadable. It needs to be something that you can go through a range of motion long term. So things like sit-ups, crunches, leg raises, machine crunches, rope. There's a million different variations of this, toes to bar, whatever. Right. So there's considerations for that. Then a lot of people want obliques, so there might be some rotation or cross-body crunching, different stuff like that. Think of these things as isolation, but they shouldn't be competing. On the other end, when we're thinking of, let's go even just really quickly through someone like longevity, a lot of this is where this goal of exercise that maybe prime the awareness of what we're trying to get them to do. So it could be to a small degree at the start of a workout. Again, you don't want to go to this point of over fatigue, but this could be a place where maybe doing a plank or a dead bug or something that teaches you spinal awareness with some degree of movement to be able to then go into your workout with things like whatever your deadlift. We're using that as an example, right? But again, that's where for the goal of longevity, you need to know how to brace, how to use the deep core, how to use the transverse abdominis, how to do these other tissues that aren't just getting through a range of motion and trying to fatigue or isolate that specific muscle
through movement.
Right. So, and really quickly, I think this is where a good time to define for a lot of people, because I think this is a conversation I have really, really often is, what is bracing and what does that even really look like? Because if I just tell someone to brace, most of the time, they just think of flex their six pack like they're flexing in the mirror.
Okay, I'm going to time you out for a second. So we just talked a lot about movement.
Yes.
We also talked about movement in isolation. That can be conflicting for people.
Yes.
We're talking about an isolated movement pattern like an abdominal crunch.
Yes.
So it's moving, but it's also isolated to particularly segments of the spine, right? In this case, maybe some of the hips, depending on what your hip flexion, depending on what you're doing here. But we're isolating movement, not an isolation move like a plank move where we've isolated movement out of the body. There is no movement or articulation of the joints at all.
Yes.
Okay, so just as a distinction here.
Yeah.
Now we're talking about something different. So the bracing piece versus the movement piece and how they interplay. So let's define what bracing is for people that may not understand what that is.
Yes. So bracing generally, when we think about this, especially when we're thinking in the gym, is trying to create a tension in the structures of the trunk and the hips and things like that to resist movement, to allow a lot of what we call like force coupling in the joints or the systems away from it.
I mean, you could consider
something like a plank. Is how do I brace? Right? But I can tell you a lot of people could do a plank and not really be bracing because they have no connection.
I don't disagree, but for people listening,
that's an exercise. So this is where even things like the breath, like the pelvic floor, like the control of the TVA, which is that kind of corset muscle that goes around the trunk, having control of those things, and then the internal and external obliques. And then we've talked about these other tissues, having awareness of how to control those things. That's really, really important for if your goal is longevity or even performance on the other side of things. Of it's not flexing your abs. There's a lot of lateral tension. There's a lot of filling in through the abdominal cavity. And there's even some can be contraction for some people of their pelvic floor and things like that.
While being able to breathe.
While being able to breathe is a very important component, right? Not holding your breath for a set of 10 squats. That's not a good idea. Even from
while being able to breathe, but then also use your extremities.
Yes, exactly. Time. Yes. Yeah. So
it's a skill.
That's a skill in and of that. So some people, it may just be that motor learning mechanism of how do I actually learn to brace? And there's lots of different exercises we can do with that. But a lot of that is doing things that resist movement, like a plank. But then can you breathe? Can you have an even pressure? Or are you distending in your midsection? Are you able to pull in and brace? There's lots of considerations with that. So bracing is more of a 360 pressure, more of a lot of tissues being involved, even with your lats, glutes, adductors, things like that, not just flexing your six pack. So for someone, if your goal is longevity, is learning how to do that so you can utilize that when needed is really important. At the end of that, you can also work these things to still a capacity standpoint or fatigue. So doing things like your plank at the end of the workout, this is where you could challenge them more and you could overload them more and you can have that kind of component.
Depending on their level of conditioning.
Depending on their level of conditioning, what they have left in the tank, what you did in the other workout, all that kind of stuff. I also really like, this is where something like a carry can come into play.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
So carries are really, really good. There's tons of different ways to work these cross connect patterns, but there's also these ways to work just a normal farmer's carry at the side. But these kind of things are, can you go through locomotion while resisting movement, while controlling that movement with this external load?
Which is very practical.
Which is very, very practical for a lot of people, having that ability to do so. So this is where, and even I love pairing something like a plank, where it's more isolated, you can learn how to connect and resist that movement with a carry, because there's this kind of carryover effect, pun intended, of being able to work this pattern of how do I isolate, be able to control my trunk, and then how do I apply some degree of movement with this varying degree in something like a carry, which is important to have capacity to have that ability. So yes, when we get into the performance talk, you should be able to rotate and do these different patterns and things like that as well. But if you can't, even from day one, if you can't create tension in your system to resist in something like a carry, and then you're just going into rotation, that's where you're going to run into issues for a lot of people. And you might have something like injury. Again, there's a lot of things that can go there, but there might be a more propensity for injury or things like that.
It's just mechanical dysfunction, because you're going to have areas that are going to have to take over for the lack of strength or capacity in that area. And yes, it could go to injury, but it's often just means something else gets overworked, gets overdone, and then that leads to there's a chain of events that happens there. Maybe injury happens in there somewhere. Yeah. But I don't like to base everything around if you do this or don't do this, you're going to get hurt.
Happen.
Yes, there's so much more.
Which is again
so much more nuance.
And that's a really easy way to create controversy.
Exactly.
And be divided and have these different camps. Yeah. Do you have something you want to say?
No.
Yeah. Sorry, I thought I cut you off there. All right. So again, just looking at who you mentioned, the carry piece and the bracing piece. So for people that I've heard the term bracing before and whatnot. I mentioned the plank as a way to imagine or think about, what you feel like when you might be bracing. But not, to your point, not everybody understands how to brace, but could plank, and they can do it all day long, but they still don't have a good understanding of how to brace. The reality of that situation is laying on the floor or being pronated or prone on the floor, with your elbows on the floor, or even your hands on the floor and your feet on the floor. It's not something you're doing a lot.
No.
Like you should be able to do the standing, and then you should be in isolation. And then you should also be able to do it with movement. And stepping straight into the carry without a strong understanding of how your body does that in isolation, but then also maybe just adding little things, like a little bit of rotation and disassociating the upper from the lower body, the lower body, right? So, before I get out there and I start putting one heavy kettlebell in one hand and start walking down through the gym with it, where I am now being challenged in rotation and flexion and extension,
bending.
right? Side bending. I don't want to overdo and say it's a complex movement. It isn't. It actually is a very simple movement. We do it all day long, every day.
Yes.
You're carrying your gym bag out of the gym, you're doing it right now, or a bag of groceries or whatever else, your duffel bag that you call your purse. Yeah. It's the same thing. The point of this is understanding what your body's doing from the inside out in order to make that happen and do it really well, right? So you could start this with building this association or building this awareness through learning how to brace first, and then starting to add smaller amounts of movement, this articulation through the spine. Again, and then it could get down into the hips. Then you could add even the knees. Then you could add shoulder girdles and all that other kind of stuff, and kind of layer it on. Most people don't really need a ton of this. And so this is going to go back to the plank and what I think I alluded to before is I don't spend a lot of time there. No. We do it for a minute, maybe. Or when I say a minute, I mean that just in a larger context of things. It's hey, we're going to try this. I just want you to build some awareness here. And now we're fucking moving. Yes. Because life doesn't happen in isolation. right?
Nor does it happen on the floor.
And it doesn't happen on the floor in the prone position, right? It happens up in space with our feet on the floor or in some type of an environment or terrain where we have to be able to respond and react to it. So I want to get somebody very quickly in my mind. I don't care where they're coming into this, as fast as I can get them, right? Even if they've got some acute injury or whatever, I'm trying to accelerate this as quickly as I can. Obviously, that's relative to the person and their issue. I'm trying to get them off the fucking floor and onto their feet, doing something that matters to me, right? That should matter to them. Being able to walk, right, and run and move through space, most humans should probably be concerned with this versus getting down onto the floor and holding this plank position. So if you're using the plank as a primary exercise in any of your workout programs, I'm going to say right now, I think you should probably think about that.
Yes,
like, what are you doing? And going back to your carry and who would be doing that versus not. Maybe we were talking about this before. I'm not sure if it came up or not. I'm sure a lot of people bad-mouthing the carries as if this is worthless
Oh,
exercise.
for sure. Yeah, I mean, and that's the other side of the building muscle, right? Because in theory, right, a carry is resisting movement. And when we're resisting movement, that's kind of a dynamic isometric, right? So it's a dynamic isometric.
People that understand what you just said will understand that you were very right about that.
Yeah.
But it might be confusing to the general listener. Yeah.
There is, we're trying to move, but we're trying to resist movement that we don't want, right? That's the way to think about it. So really with that, like we said earlier, for building muscle, if you say that a carry is not going through a range of motion, I'm not going through these specific intentional.
It's very small range of motion.
It's very small range of motion. And the goal is not to have range of motion, which is where we're going to build muscle. So I'm going to badmouth a carry if I think that the goal in the gym is to build muscle, which we've talked about. There's more goals in the gym than just how do I build the most muscle from this exercise.
Went through that.
Right? We just talked about
performance, aesthetics, and longevity.
Exactly. Yeah. So I said this in another podcast too about it was rotation. I think it was rotation and lateral movement. I forget the exact title, but we talked about, I think the big thing, and this applies to rotation, everything is integrated with the core, and that is your ability to isolate, like in something like a plank. You mentioned your ability to disassociate limbs or trunk, rib cage, pelvis, things like that. And then now your ability to integrate. So this is where, even from a longevity standpoint, but then I think really where it does start to apply for more of the performance is you need to be able to integrate these things. So that's where you can start to think about adding some degrees of rotation, whether it's in an exercise, like we've talked about with rotation, maybe just adding a little extra rotation in your rowing, things like that. Or if it's a specific, like a wood chop or a medicine ball toss or things like that, it's starting to incorporate that where you can accelerate, decelerate, deal with these varying degrees of forces is very important for if your goal is to be robust and well-rounded for longevity, but also robust and well-rounded as an athlete.
For performance.
For performance, right? For a large degree of athletes, right? So we kind of talked about that. So when we go to the athletic side, again, this athlete, especially let's say if we're like a young athlete or the goal is performance and they're learning these things. And we've talked about needing to be able to do the basics. So even the pros, even the person who is the most advanced in whatever skill, whether it's their sport or in the gym, is they still go and do these touch-ups on the basics. Mm-hmm. So yes, this athlete, especially if they're acute with some sort of injury, and this might be part of the treatment protocol, but just also touching on, are they still able to brace? Do they still have a connection with the deep core? Do they still have a connection with resisting movement and things like carries or planks or whatever? There's a million different exercises. Now, though, we're doing these check-ins, these touch-ups on those exercises, and they may be 30-second warm-up on your Tuesday because you feel like you need a little bit more connection with it. Right. And then from there, but as an athlete, you should be able to deal with varying degrees of forces in various planes of motion. So this doesn't necessarily mean, which we see a lot, standing on a Bosu ball and having your coach hit you with a ball to try to resist movement. But you should be able to rotate, produce force, do these different exercises that you are accelerating, decelerating, and even something like sprinting, right? If you have no control of your trunk and you're trying to sprint maximally, you're not going to be able to get to the joint angles that you need. You're not going to be able to produce force well, and you're not efficient, right? You're inefficient. So all of this, that is core training for the athlete or for performance. But you can't do that effectively if day one you have no control or awareness of how to control your trunk and deep core and all those different things. So
so I think that was
really good.
Yeah, there's a lot to that, and without trying to unpack it all, I think a lot of people go, this is what I know I'm not disconnected with, because this has been the same shit for however long before I even came through. When we used to give tours, right? of the gym.
Back in the big box.
Back in the gym.
Oh, I love.
We had like these were like 40,000 square foot facilities that we had. So there was a lot to tour. There was a lot to look at, right? Everything from steam rooms to the big group exercise rooms to all the equipment, right? And that was our job, was to take them around and put them on all this equipment and get them to feel it.
Yes.
Right. So
yeah.
Mrs. Jones, this is the A bench. We had 12 of these things in a row, right?
Yeah.
And there would be a line every night. People wanting to get on these things, which was very, it looked like the ab roller, but it was big. If anybody remembers, you guys might be too young for that. No, not CeCe. She's definitely old enough. There was a thing that went gangbusters on like the Home Shopping Network type channels of the day. It was called the ab roller. And that's basically what this thing looked like. This machine looked like. It was just up off the floor as a bench. It cost 10 times as much or more.
Is that where you put your arms on it? And
No. It was behind you. It was behind you. It was like doing a crunch, right? Your feet were up on, your legs were resting in on a pad, on a pad that, like in a cradle, and it just hinged in the middle, but you reach back and it had handles that were about by your ears, and you would just move into this crunch.
Oh, they still have those. I know.
Yes. Yeah, okay. But I don't think they're called the A bench anymore. They're called something else. So there's a manufacturer that came out there called the A bench. I digress.
Yes.
So we would take everybody by there. Everybody by that thing.
Burn.
Right, yeah. And you get down there. So Mrs. Jones, this is the A bench. And so you really wanted to train your abs. You told me you wanted to train your abs.
Yeah.
I didn't try and correct you on any of that, or whether I knew or didn't know, that what you're talking about is building some muscle, losing some body fat. But I know this lady, in order for me to sell her the $3,000 gym membership or the $1,600 single membership, which is what those things cost in the day. Again, I digress. I got to put this bitch on the fucking ab machine, because that's the last machine we're going to touch before I sit her down in that sales chair and try to get her checkbook, or probably her checkbook or her credit card away from her.
Yes.
And what did I always say? So, Mrs. Jones, can you feel that work in your abs? Can you feel that burn?
Yeah.
As if that means a fucking thing.
Yes.
Right? In terms of results. And I think so. All of this said, whether you're an athlete, longevity, aesthetics, so athlete being like the performance end of things.
Yes.
If you're looking for feel, then you've already lost your way. And so in that, like if you do a heavy, like let's say a trap bar carry or kettlebell carry through the gym, are you feeling your abs? Like, what do you feel working? Like,
yes.
I can tell you what I feel is I'm challenged to keep my breathing rate where it needs to be.
Yes.
Right? I'm challenged to maintain my posture, and I'm not feeling my abdominals at all.
I'm feeling a full body co-contraction tension. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But
my grip.
Right. but however, in that sense, like that is ab training, if you want to call it, if you want to really break it down to its very simple basis, right? Or core training.
Yes.
Right. If you don't have that, you can't do that, right? If you don't have that stability, that strength at some level, you cannot do that. Even if I get into like say a med ball throw, right? A rotational med ball throw against the wall or something like that from standing. Am I feeling my abs burning? No, I'm feeling my heart rate get up. I'm feeling my capacity being challenged, right? So, but at the same time, it would be the same exercise. It would almost be the same exercise as if I was hanging from a bar trying to do some isolated work to get my to feel my abs working. Now, they're working the same musculature, they're just working them in a different way. So
yes,
I just bring all that up to say is I think a lot of people go into it, and I guarantee you that's the same. I'm fired up about this because it's so dumb and so boring to me that we're even still talking about this. But going back to your person who started their workout with their abdominal stuff, why?
Yeah.
Because they need that emotional fucking satisfaction.
Yes.
And to me, that is just so...
Yes.
It's just so weird to me. But at this point, maybe in my younger days, I don't know how old this person is, or maybe in my younger days, I used to think like that a little bit, like I have to do this. But I know early in time, I was like, no, this is not the right way to train.
Yes.
But people are still searching for that emotional like connection to a specific exercise, to a specific feel. And they've made up in their mind, because I feel it here, it will give me this result. Yeah. So when approaching ab or core training, don't be an idiot.
Yes.
And so you've kind of gone through the steps on maybe how you integrate those things simply. And I don't want to go, again, too far into the rabbit hole, but is there anything else, you want to talk about that you're seeing, like people are just, this is so discombobulated still, or there's still so much confusion here. Is there anything in there that we need to clear up?
I think the overall theme of this, whether you are in pain, not in pain, have goals of performance, aesthetics, all different stuff, is be careful. We just had a whole podcast on being careful who you're getting information from, of that don't get dogmatic about one way of thinking, and that knowing for most of these training intentions, almost everything should exist in your training. It just currently depends on where you're at, what's your goal, what's your intention. For me, with clients, if I'm thinking for performance or pain management or for any of these different things, sometimes they're doing very, very specific exercises that are based on what they're currently doing. That may be doing a reverse hyper to get you into extension and flexion and different things like that. Or for some person, that may not be the right exercise for them. So don't base your whole routine or your whole decision on your exercise routine and get caught up in one way of thinking based because a person that you respect said that. Because when we were talking about this, a lot of these people that we respect, and this is our goal in this podcast, is trying to show a different side, that if you had a conversation with us, that we have a lot of reason for this, is that person that you feel that is preaching this one thing on social media, they probably have a lot more awareness that a lot of these intricacies exist. They're just trying to preach this thing to get awareness, to get
to drive
eyes
traffic.
on them, to drive traffic, all that kind of stuff. So when we're talking about ab versus core training, what's your goal? Are you trying to increase performance? Are you trying to build muscle in that specific area? And then base things off of that. And have different times in your training where both exist. Have different times in your training where you are focusing more on, I really want to work my six pack because I want to try to build these abs up for in the next summer when I try to lean out, things like that. Or on the other side of things, like I'm trying to be better at pickleball or something like that, and I want to get my rotation, things like that. Know that you need to be able to do other things that aren't just sit-ups and things like that, or whatever exercise. So you should be able to resist movement. You should be able to produce movement. Your spine should be able to flex and extend.
Just like everywhere else.
Just like everywhere else. Your spine should be able to rotate. You should ideally be able to minimize rotation and flexion, extension, things like that. And I think the last thing that I would want to say with this is training your abs a bunch is not going to reduce your belly fat. I still hear that a lot. Man, you can't spot reduce that by doing 1,000 crunches.
This is why I don't do it.
Yes.
This is why I don't even have the conversation anymore. Like I can't.
I still had that conversation last week. With
I can't. It's fine. Like I understand people don't understand. I want to be empathetic and compassionate at some level, but at some point it's just like, come on, man.
Yes.
You need to learn how your body works.
Exactly.
Right? And it's yours. Like I would want to know how that works, but they can tell me all the things about their brand new car they have out there or whatever new device they've got in their hands or video game or whatever. They know all that stuff. Or in my world, like they can tell me all the things about their brand new $5,000 handgun, optic, stipple job, new trigger, new trigger bar polishing they just had done, the weapon light and why they chose and all that shit. And they still don't understand that doing abdominal crunches doesn't reduce or spot reduce belly fat.
Yes.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. At the end of the day, I think the big takeaway is there's room for all of this.
Yes.
Right. And everybody's training program. So when you're looking, when you're hearing things or you're making decisions based on, or you're making decisions about your exercise selection, think about the concepts, think about the larger whole and how to apply those concepts to the things. And absolutely abdominal crunches and toes to bar might exist in there. Yes. It is, but that's one thing. That's one part of it.
I'm sorry. I was in my own head. You said absolutely.
Oh, yeah. It absolutely might exist. So yeah, you might be doing that. Again, nothing wrong with toes to bar. Nothing wrong with an abdominal crunch. Nothing wrong with any of that stuff. Nothing wrong with the A bench for those people that are still using it. But the question should be why and how does it fit into the bigger picture?
Yes.
And going all the way back, I think you have to understand the distinction at some level. Again, you mentioned a lot of anatomy in there, but you have to understand the distinction between like ab training, core training, and really we're talking about the same thing. But when I think it's safe to say, and I would agree with you that when people say ab training, they're talking about rectus abdominis training, oblique training, the things that they can see in the mirror, right? And so the exercises often kind of drift to those, so much so that it's the first thing we're doing when we walk into the gym, as you've already said. So avoid that stuff. I think when you look at our own programming and kind of where it shows up, there is very much of this. Let's build a base and understand how these things function. Most of your quote unquote core and abdominal training is going to come through your more complex compound movements that you're doing. That's why having an awareness of this stuff is so important and where it fits in. And then, but you will find, ab training in isolation in our movements.
Yeah.
For two reasons. One, because it's important. Two, because we know people want it, right?
Yes.
And it's like, when you're delivering as a coach, like when you're delivering a workout program or a class or something to somebody, like, I get it. Like there has to be, like, you got to satisfy them emotionally at some point. So if you're going to do that, if you can just try to strike a balance between practical application and emotional satisfaction, so that you can get a little bit of both in there and still feel like you're providing there's some efficacy in what it is that you just did there. Fucking do that, right? And that's part of it. Like I didn't just fall off the turnip truck. At the same time, if you're that guy that's having that conversation, to your point, where it is all one-sided all the time, carries are dumb because they're not going to help you build abs. Right? You're not going to see your abs. You're not going to build any muscle. That's stupid. And if you're saying you never need to train abs except for, about 6 weeks out from a show, right? And, that's when you start doing it. I think that's stupid too.
Yes.
I don't think there's really any room for argument. And somebody will want to, and that's why by me making that statement, it will create conversation. That's why I never create those. That's just why I stay out of the conversation. So again, like we don't have any, and we never did this, and I refuse to do it, but people are like, hey, you got to have all these guides. I bet 90% of like trainers, or maybe it's not that much anymore, maybe like more like 80% of trainers, coaches, fitness programs, they're going to have a how to build abs guide.
Sign up for their app guide.
Yes. Yeah.
In 6 weeks, by the way.
In their thing.
Yeah.
The one thing you'll see abs is like with us, and I don't even think there's a guide there, but it's more of like the reason you don't have abs, and it's not because you're training. Yeah. Right. It's there's other things there, but the again, like buying the ab guide as a means to get whatever that is for you. I think hard about that. Again, it's a good sales tool, and lead generation is mostly emotional. And I think a lot of this information that you're saying, how this thing started, that's where it's come from. It's like, hey, how do I push somebody's buttons here to create engagement and so forth? I get it. Like, have I done it? Probably. I don't prefer to do it that way, but yeah, be careful who you get your information from. Again, I think it's another, it's just kind of working on the theme of where we're coming from right now. Thanks, guys.